begin.
The bill will essentially criminalize thousands of Canadians, despite the fact it is the legal firearms owners that support training and licensing and registration, and despite all of the things they have done to stay in compliance and promote education programs, and despite following the see something, say something principle, the legal gun owners are now the ones being targeted by legislation. Hear, hear. The government wants to take away the firearms from the people who have been advocating for licensing, but are now having their property expropriated.
Bobcat 1-2.
Target acquired.
Bill's second reading, projet de loi, deuxième lecture, number 1, Bill S-13.
Stand.
Number 2, Bill C-21.
Senator Wallin.
Thank you, Speaker. A former advisor to President Obama, David Plouffe, pulled back the curtain on how politicians sometimes play politics. He called it the stray voltage effect. He explained, people pay attention to and engage with controversy. So, as a politician, you either commit to a side, regardless of whether you've even thought about it or not, and then you support or oppose vehemently. That is exactly what has become of gun control legislation, Bill C-21. Those who live a more rural life or love to hunt or sport shoot, and those who live in urban centres where crime is high. Two very different worldviews. As the Chief Firearms Officer of Saskatchewan says, the bill will essentially criminalize thousands of Canadians, despite the fact that, as Robert Freeberg explains, it is the legal firearms owners that support training and licensing and registration, and despite all of the things they have done to stay in compliance and promote education programs, and despite following the see something, say something principle, the legal gun owners are now the ones being targeted by legislation. Hear, hear. The government wants to take away the firearms from the people who have been advocating for licensing of firearms, but are now having their property expropriated. The only way the government proceeded on this bill, and this was on several occasions, I think prevented an informed parliamentary debate or proper committee hearings with a full range of witnesses. Instead, they used cabinet orders to regulate, quote, the circumstances in which an individual does or does not need firearms. All the more reason for this bill to be well studied by the Senate. We need evidence and facts, not just opinion and politics. And as if to further alienate rural voters everywhere, the Liberals are actually reducing the punishment for crimes committed using guns. With the passage of Bill C-5, the government has repealed 1/3 of all mandatory minimum prison sentences, including for some 14 firearms and tobacco and drug-related offences. So here's the issue in a nutshell. If you want to stop illegal gun crime, you need to crack down on gangs and gun smugglers and not on hunters and farmers. Hear, hear. So when we are told about increasing penalties for smugglers from 10 to 14 years, it sounds great. But today, right now, no one has ever been given the maximum penalty of even 10 years. So 14 years makes no difference. Senator Plett suggested the other day that perhaps there was one such case, but we're not sure. Legislation and governments must turn their attention to the people who are constantly in and out of the system, who have firearms prohibitions against them, but too often get cut loose in a few hours after an arrest. Chances are the bad guys have more firearms or access to them, and they just go get more and often end up retaliating against the persons involved in their arrest or conviction. So since 2015, the soft-on-crime approach has seen violent crime increase 32%, with 124,000 more violent crime incidents in 2021 compared to 2015. And gang-related homicides have increased 92%. As we all know, crime is about people who commit the crime. Confiscating guns or knives, and the knives are now actually responsible for an increasing number of deaths, will not prevent this. A tire iron, a kitchen knife, or a fist can kill if that's the intent. Government also disingenuously uses the endless, horrific, and deadly gun-related events south of the border to trigger the debate here, a Uvalde or a Buffalo. But we are operating in two completely different environments. C-21 does not meaningfully address the root causes of gun violence: illegal smuggling, gang violence, illegal drug trade, drug addiction. We need to focus on rehabilitation, not red tape.
Sorry to interrupt you. Honourable Senators, it is now 6 o'clock, and pursuant to Rule 331, I am obliged to leave the chair until 8 o'clock, when we will resume, unless it is your wish, Honourable Senators, to not see the clock. Is it agreed to not see the clock? So ordered. Senator Wallin.
As I was saying, ladies and gentlemen, C-21 does not meaningfully address the root causes of gun violence: the illegal drug trade, drug addiction, illegal smuggling, gang violence. Again, I will quote the words of Saskatchewan's chief firearms officer, who says, "If you look at the firearms that have been seized and used in crime, they aren't finding these assault-style firearms. They aren't being used. It's a great optic. They look scary, but every firearm can look scary. It's really the end use. When we look at the American news, they have few regulations, little vetting, they have no education programs, they have no safe storage requirements. Those firearms aren't registered, and it's an entirely different paradigm than here in Canada." The government often uses the U.S. events and their lack of rules to make a case for Canadian law, things to shore up their own base, to look tough on crime for urban voters. But these moves sometimes backfire. The plan to freeze handgun sales, in fact, triggered a buying frenzy. And many handguns have gone underground, family-owned handguns, because it's so complicated to transfer to a son or a daughter. And of course, in the end, it will shutter hundreds of small businesses across this country that employ thousands of people selling legal guns to sane, non-criminal buyers. This bill could also set a precedent for further bans and confiscations that the government may deem necessary for, in their words, greater good, safety, and the well-being of citizens. It is a bit of a slippery slope. This legislation, sadly, has little to do with saving innocent lives. The bill puts hunters, collectors, and sport shooters in the crosshairs, but not the criminals. And let's not forget that an important but always forgotten effect of this bill might actually have to do with the cost of living. Many Canadians could use a gun to go hunting. As the cost of putting food on the table skyrockets, a deer or a moose in the deep freeze can make a real difference. And killing the coyote that's killing your cattle saves money and also puts food on the table. But such practical thinking is not just part of the mindset here in the halls of Parliament. Let's hope that we can ensure that we look at all aspects of this bill, the potential collateral damage for businesses and hunters, including Indigenous hunters with the traditional and treaty right to do so. Consider the impact on families. Treat addictions that lead to crime. Enforce the full measure of the law on those who commit crimes with guns. Don't defund the police or underfund the firearms officers. Support their good work. And support legal gun ownership. And throw the book at the bad guys. The House of Commons had a duty and a responsibility to create a better piece of legislation, and it failed. So it now falls to us. Let's actually try to make sure C-21 does something to make the country safer. And let's also make sure that our laws respect the rights of law-abiding citizens. Thank you.
Senator LaBoucane-Benson.
Thank you, Speaker. Honourable Senators, I rise to speak at second reading of Bill C-21, which makes amendment to the Criminal Code and Firearms Act. The bill proposes to change Canada's firearms laws designed to better protect communities from gun violence, with particular emphasis on addressing gender-based violence, combating smuggling, cracking down on ghost guns, which are untraceable firearms built illegally on 3D printers. Also, crucially, the bill formalizes the national freeze on the sale, purchase, transfer, and importation of handguns enacted last year. I'm supportive of these measures and look forward to seeing C-21 progress through the remaining stages of the legislative process. But my reason for speaking today is to discuss the role of firearms in Indigenous communities and to share some thoughts that I hope will be useful to Senators as our debate and study of the legislation continues. For many Indigenous families, mine included, hunting is central to our history, culture, livelihoods, and sustenance. Indigenous harvesting rights are treaty rights and enshrined in Canada's Constitution in 1982. Any law affecting firearms must preserve these rights. Moreover, the right to hunt and trap is deeply connected to Indigenous food security, connection to culture, rite of passage, and identity formation. And with permission from my husband and my son, I want to share one of our family stories that illustrates this. My husband, my brother, his brothers, my father, and other extended family members gather for a week every fall at a family hunting camp. My youngest son, Gabe, has attended the camp since he was a small boy. He's learned so many life lessons at hunting camp, including bush skills, survival on the land, tracking, his sacred relationship with animals he harvests, and gun safety. And then one day he went out with his dad and my father. They had smudged earlier that morning, and as the smudge passed under the guns and over the ammo, he prayed that he would become a hunter that day. His prayers were answered when he was the first to spot a deer on the cut line, and it stayed long enough for him to convince his dad that it was his time. He did exactly as he was taught. He got out of the truck slowly and with purpose. He aimed. He took a deep breath. He aimed again. And when he was completely sure he could make the perfect shot, he fired. And when the deer fell, he walked to the animal with tears in his eyes. He put tobacco down, and he thanked the deer for giving its life so his family could eat. His dad showed him how to make the other offerings and to ensure the cleanliness of the food he was bringing home. In this moment, with humility and gratitude, he understood the complexity of our sacred right to hunt. Alan called me, and I was in tears. We knew he had entered the next stage of his life, that this was an important rite of passage in his journey. And when they arrived home, Gabe helped his dad to prepare, package, and freeze the meat. The next day, we hosted a feast with 4 elders. Gabe helped me make the deer stew, and he offered all of the rest of the meat to the elders at our kitchen table, who gave him teachings about becoming a man, his responsibility to his family, his community, and to the animals he would harvest, and his sacred relationship with the land. A few years later, when he brought his first moose back to hunting camp, he was presented with tobacco and given his first eagle feather. He had proven he could survive in the bush, and he was able to feed his family. It is with so much pride that I can say all 3 of our sons are capable traditional hunters, and I will never, ever go hungry. Indeed, colleagues, hunting, fishing, and trapping are activities that forge stronger community bonds, provide a vehicle for the transmission of sacred teachings, and foster a sense of responsibility to our community and natural world. And, as the late Dr. Harold Cardinal told my husband, Alan's formidable bush skills were transferable, and one of the reasons he was a successful CEO. Senators, my family has a variety of guns, large and small, that are specific to the animal that will be harvested. There are also family guns that have been passed down from generation to generation. My dad has gifted our sons my grandfather's guns as an acknowledgement of their hard work at camp and the fact that they're just such amazing traditional hunters. Every single one of these guns is legal, and it's stored safely. Also, Alan, my husband, was the co-producer of 2 videos about Indigenous people's hunting rights and getting a personal acquisition license, or PAL. Alberta Fish and Wildlife and the RCMP were partners in these video productions in an effort to build relationships between police, conservation officers, and Indigenous hunters. Every Canadian, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, who wants to purchase a firearm must apply for a PAL. There are also long-standing provisions within the licensing process that help Indigenous people get their PAL and therefore ensure that Indigenous hunting rights are preserved. At the same time, Indigenous communities have frequently been impacted by firearms violence, often for reasons stemming intergenerational and historic trauma. Like all other Canadians, Indigenous people want and deserve to be protected from threats to community safety, such as gender-based violence and gang violence, and have measures in place to reduce the risk of suicide. Senators, my husband has been crystal clear. If ever one of his guns were to become prohibited, he would decommission or surrender it. Because the right to hunt, a sacred right given to us by the Creator, not by the government, is not tied to the use of a particular firearm. And the right to live in a safe community is also sacred. But, Senators, the truth is that Bill C-21 would not change the classification of a single firearm. Last fall, the government proposed amendments during committee study in the other place that would have made some classification changes. At the time, some Indigenous communities and organizations felt that they hadn't been sufficiently consulted on the amendments. I'm glad that the government took a pause at that point and spent several months having conversations with Indigenous organizations and rights holders, including the Assembly of First Nations, the Métis National Council, Inuit Tapirit Kanatami, the Manitoba Métis Federation, Tribal Chiefs Ventures, which represents several First Nations on Treaty 6 territory in Alberta, Manitoba �𝐼𝐞𝐚𝐿, Métis Nation of British Columbia, the Hunting, Fishing and Trapping Coordinating Committee, which deals with the harvesting rights in northern Quebec, the Native Council of PEI, 𝐷𝐿𝐴𝐻𝑡𝐾𝐽 Nation of New Brunswick, and the First Nations Chief of Police Associations. And from what I've heard about these discussions, several key themes emerged. First, many Indigenous people and organizations agree with the principle that certain firearms are too dangerous and not appropriate for civilian use. Second, the preservation of harvesting rights and of firearms used to exercise these rights is a top priority for Indigenous communities. Third, it's important for many Indigenous people to be able to pass their firearms down from one generation to the next. And finally, it was repeatedly emphasized that Indigenous organizations and rights holders want to work with the government on matters related to regulation of firearms. Early and ongoing consultation can help maximize buy-in among members of the Indigenous communities, maximize the effectiveness of the laws, and minimize misinformation about what a particular law or amendment does. So, the results of the extensive consultations was that the amendment introduced last fall was withdrawn. Some, such as amendments focused on combating the spread of ghost guns, was reintroduced and adopted. In its current form, Bill C-21 would enshrine the handgun freeze that's been in effect for a year, maintain the prohibition of approximately 1,500 assault-style rifles enacted in 2020, and establish a technical definition of assault-style firearms to be applied going forward to prevent newly designed or manufactured assault-style firearms from entering the Canadian market. But for hunters, the bottom line is, if there is a long gun you're using for hunting today, you'll still be able to use it when Bill C-21 passes. And for all Canadians, including Indigenous people, the bill will help protect us from gun violence and make our communities safer. Colleagues, let's get Bill C-21 to committee and study as soon as possible. Hi.
Senator Martin. L'honorable Sénatrice Martin propose appui de...
The Honourable Senator Martin, supported by Senator Seidman, asks that this move to the next sitting of the Senate. Is it your pleasure to adopt the motion? It is. Carried.
I know you take offense to all of our questions. They are partisan. They are not becoming of an opposition. You hesitate when somebody says, oh, on this side, you stop speaking. You self-righteously tell us how bad we are. Minister Mendicino, leader, has misled Canadians many, many times. Admit that, leader. That's true. He is ineffective in so many ways. We need more than one question period just to lay them out, especially with your non-answers. He also misled Canadians about Bill C-21, leader, at every step of the way, including the amendments. We all know that he did, leader. He said that he had respect for law-abiding gun owners. No, he doesn't. He targeted them, not the criminals. He targeted hunters, farmers, Indigenous Canadians, sport shooters, and Canadians who live in rural areas. They could see the truth, leader, despite whatever Minister Mendicino claimed. Why can't you? It even turned out that NHL star Carey Price knew more about the minister's bill than the minister himself. Perhaps some ministers would have been shamed into telling the truth after being so publicly embarrassed. Minister Mendicino is not, and now you're carrying his water for him in here, leader. Leader isn't misleading Canadians about C-21 or misleading Canadians about anything. A reason for a minister to resign.
Senator Gold.
Well, thank you for your question. I hesitated only when I'm interrupted in my response by the other side, as I will continue to do. And
Senator Gold.
The government has confidence in Minister Mendicino's handling of the files, and again, the allegations and insinuations they're making are not based upon the facts.
Senator Boisvenu.
Senator Boisvenu.